Welcome to Green Money Matters, the podcast where your financial future meets the planet's well-being, bringing you the latest on climate issues and uncovering new and exciting investment opportunities that make a positive impact. From renewable energy projects to eco-friendly startups, we'll dive deep into the companies and funds that are driving change and making a difference. Whether you're a seasoned investor or just starting your journey, Green Money Matters is here to empower you with knowledge, insights, and actionable tips that'll supercharge your portfolio and make a positive impact on the planet. So get ready to invest with a conscience and join the growing movement of individuals who are reshaping the financial landscape. Welcome to Green Money Matters with your host, Chris Everitt.
So welcome to Green Money Matters, the podcast where we explore how money, investment, and influence shape the transition to a more sustainable future. My guest today is Gail Gallie. Gail has spent much of her career working at the intersection of media and communications and social change, helping major organizations and campaigns think about how ideas spread, how behavior changes, and how public attention is mobilized. One of the things that struck me while preparing for this conversation is that much of Gail's work seems to be built around a simple but powerful idea that lasting change doesn't happen unless culture changes first. And it got me wondering about whether some of our biggest environmental challenges are really at their heart, not just financial or political problems, but cultural ones. Gail, you spent much of your career understanding how culture influences behavior. Have you come to believe that environmental problems are ultimately cultural problems?
Hi, thanks for having me on. I think it's an and. I don't think you could listen to your setup and think, oh, if we fix the culture, the sort of finance piece will sort itself out. And I don't think that is true. But I do think culture or lack of attention to it when it comes to environmental matters, it has possibly exacerbated the situation that we're in. Yes. And so that's, I think, why I lent into it in the first place, realizing there was a gap.
Okay. And what specific examples led you to that point?
I think it's having worked in and around this space for the best place of a decade, even a bit longer. If you look back even further as well, the kind of communications that have come out from the environmental movement, they're all pretty doomy, right? They're all pretty monoculture and they're what I call doom comms. And I understand why. It's because the situation is pretty distressing and increasingly. But if you were to analyze the kind of culture that is created out of the environmental movement from the 80s onwards, it's been the same tonality, just getting louder. And I always think of it as if you're trying to make a point to someone and your line of argument's not working, if you just start shouting, let's face it, a lot of people do this. If you then just start shouting the same argument, you're not going to have any more success. But you're just going to make people run away from you and hope that you stop shouting. And I worried looking at the landscape of environmental communications, especially from a nature perspective, that in fact was what had been happening for the last 30, 40 years. And maybe that's why it wasn't cutting through anymore, because as humans were hardwired to walk away from someone who's shouting something, especially when it looks scary or horrible. I don't know if you've got children. The very, very basic premise of raising children is you tell them stories, don't you? So even the most muppet of a parent knows that you're supposed to tell your kids stories before they go to sleep. You don't shout at them about the world collapsing. You tell them a story that makes them in the mood to go to sleep. And so I think the stories that we were telling were unilaterally dreadful and terrifying. And clearly that if that had worked, fantastic, I wouldn't have got involved. But it hadn't worked, and it certainly hadn't worked to move the big, important financial pieces in the right direction. So I thought, let's try something else.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it struck me again recently. There are so many arguments, or there are so many issues where people get very violently opposed to the premise. Like there was a post about veganism, and the arguments were either violently pro or very violently against. Maybe that's a condition of the sort of the siloization of chat these days. But how do you influence that?
Yeah, the polarization, isn't it? This is what you're speaking to there. And I agree with you. That definitely seems to be how the filter through which we receive any messages, especially on social media, it seems to be you either have to be violently in agreement or, as you say, violently against. I think I'm not quite speaking to that. I think I think I'm speaking to, there's a problem with a lot of science and the way it gets presented as well. I don't know if you've worked with many scientists. Obviously, they dwell in the realm of trying to prove things are real, fact. And it's very difficult to get scientists to move away from a peer-reviewed set of facts. And they tend to therefore be looking behind them. I was recently at a talk with Thomas Crowther, who's a friend of mine and a scientist, and he's written a new book about the concept of feedback loops and how in nature feedback loops, one bit of the forest starts doing well on something and the next bit of the forest will notice that, and then the feedback loop will begin, the change spreads. And much in the same way with science, I think scientists, if we only project the fact that it's terrible, the feedback loop is that's all you look out for in a scientific paper, to prove that, yes, indeed, it is terrible. And I think there's something of that in the communications industry as well. There's a sort of race to the bottom when it comes to how terrifying can we make a collapsing ice sheet look, or how much sadness can you crowbar out of people for a skinny polar bear. And so I think I'm talking about a world where there's ands. So those things can work for a while, but ultimately people are going to turn away from them, particularly in the fragmented media landscape we've got at the moment. You'll see the polar bear, you'll flinch because you remember not feeling nice last time you saw that one. It's sort of negative feedback loop. You go the other direction. And I feel like that's more what goes on in the comms, and therefore people try and get an even worse image out there because they think, well, maybe that will get the clicks. I also remember one of my earliest jobs in this whole impact space was in charity brands. I used to did some work with things like Sport Relief and Children in Need to try and refresh their brands. And I remember talking to one of the brand leaders I was working for, one of the marketing leaders, saying the thing that really puts people off, having looked at the research, is the people on the street who they're called chuggers, aren't they? Charity muggers, because people find it really uncomfortable. And it is someone just coming up and mugging you in the street. And the next time you see that person, you're going to run a mile. And they said, yeah, but we got them once. And that's the business model works like that. It's a subscription thing. And I think, again, the communications of this stuff has fallen into the same sort of pattern, which is if we can just get them to look once, we've done our job. But actually what you've done there is got them to not look the second, third, fourth, fifth, and for the rest of time. And change doesn't happen on one viewing. You need to engage people over time. And I passionately believe that whatever you're doing, if you want to engage people over time with their precious time, you have to be engendering some form of joy and some form of connectivity and positivity that people want to come back to. And I think the doom comms, as I call them, no one sits down and thinks, oh, I hope I see one of those incredibly depressing ads in my feed. That's just not who we are. But you might think, oh, I can't wait to hear what Jane Fonda says next and that funny thing she did with Matt Damon. I don't know if you've seen it at the moment. In America, Matt Damon and Water.org have just launched this new campaign called Get Blue. And it's Matt and Gary White's incredible work to get clean and accessible water around the world. And Matt Damon's created this hilarious persona of a rapper that doesn't say anything and he's a bit rubbish, and it's killing it on social. It's absolutely brilliant. And I can't wait for the next one to come out. There would be a very different campaign you could have done about getting water to the rest of the world, but we've tried that and it doesn't work.
There's two things that's coming out of that. One, to agree with you, there's so much negativity that's going to end up with people just throwing their hands in the air and saying, well, it's all getting so much worse. What's the point? No action required.
Exactly. It's over. Exactly. And then you get the scientists going, but it's true. And to which the response is, well, it may be true, but no one's listening to it.
And what really interests me is how we then turn that message, that changing message, that engagement into capital and into action. How do you see that step working?
Yeah, and back to my analogy about storytelling, and not to say that people in the finance industries are children. I didn't say that.
Oh, yes, they are.
Everyone responds to story. And I was really struck when I'm not in finance yet. Everything I'm about to say is made up and learnt on the job with not a shred of economics training. But it really struck me when I started getting into the business of understanding capital a bit more. I remember talking to somebody about investing. I think it was sort of from a VC perspective. So how do you choose which businesses you invest in? And time again, you get the answer, oh, it's not really about the business. You look at the entrepreneur. And if that entrepreneur's good, then you might back them. And even if this first business fails, what you'll do is they'll learn from that. And then the next one could be great. And then I remember looking at those entrepreneurs that are deemed worth investing. And they're really good at telling stories, right? Because what is investing if it's not a story of what's going to happen to your money? And so people back the ones where the story sounds like my money's going to do really well. This is a hero story. This is a success story. My money's going to go in there. And whether it's going to save the day or whether it's going to grow exponentially or whether it's going to inspire lots more businesses like it, it's all story. I've got a cousin who said his boss used to say about sales, it's all story, mate, till it's in the bank. And it's true. It's all a story. And I think that the world of capital, it's got a whole language of its own. Look, capital, most of us call it money, but in the finance industry, you call it capital. That's a story in itself. You start building a story with words, and they call it maths. I think it's funny that the investment industry and finance people think they're so rational and all they're doing is mathematics. But it's not. It's storytelling with just using money as the principal characters. And the stories that were being told about the investment and the nature side of things were that this is not for us. That was a very clear, that's either philanthropy or it's maybe at best impact investing, small margins. The story that was not being told was that this is a tremendous opportunity to invest in some of the world's biggest problem spaces. And normally investing in a problem space means a massive market because everyone will jump in on a solution. But that story wasn't being told. It's beginning to be told, but what you've got against it is not just the doom comms industry, but also probably quite a lot of vested interest, people who are like to keep the investment flowing just the way it is, thank you, and they're telling really good stories. So there was just a void, really. It's not that storytelling and creativity and culture weren't the right tool, it's just they were missing, very clearly missing in this particular sector. So that I think that's what we are beginning to try and do better.
Yeah, as far as sort of money and finance concerned, I mean, expectations, some of the terminology that's used rather than telling necessarily, but expectations, what the market expects, what consumers expect. Expectations tend to deliver actually what's going to happen.
It's the feedback loops.
Yeah, you conceive something, and if you conceive it strongly enough, it'll happen. So you expect it's going to happen. 9 times out of 10, it probably will. I know you was quite fundamental in getting the word about the Sustainable Development Goals out. Tell me a little bit about that, how that came about, and how you got that into people's consciousness.
Yes, we did, absolutely. So my friend Kate Garvey and I had just both exited regular media careers, me from advertising, Kate from PR. And Kate had worked with Richard Curtis before, who's the filmmaker and humanitarian. And he was very involved in the MDGs before the SDGs, and therefore was in on the conception of the SDGs. And he had suggested to the UN, to Amina Mohammed, who was leading that process then, that if the SDGs could be made much more front-facing, they'd have more chance of being adopted and therefore achieved. Whereas the MDGs were held very much in a back end of the UN and almost deliberately secret, I think, so that nobody got involved and challenged them too much.
Okay.
So he made this pitch to make them, he didn't use this word, but coming from my background, a brand. What he was saying was if these were a global brand that would therefore travel and be recognized, people. So he in effect was saying the same thing, which is let's get them into culture, but the culture of business leaders, the culture of politics, they'll have more chance of being taken seriously. And the UN thought that was a great idea, but said to him, we will strangle that at birth. The UN is not a creative force. They're many great things, but they're not a creative branding agency. So that's when Richard got in touch with Kate, because they'd worked together before. And Kate said, my friend and I, who's done this sort of thing before, we're looking to do something. So we got together very much as a project. So the nonprofit we found to do that, we just called Project Everyone, because we thought it'd be a project to launch them once to everyone. And we did that. We coloured them. Richard retitled them so that they were things that you could actually say with your words as opposed to long policy sentences. And then we did this outrageous sort of optimistic campaign to get them, with the strapline was tell everyone. And we tried to get them to 7 billion people in 7 days after launch, just using enormous kind of interventions like how many texts can we get the mobile companies to send? Could we get a football team to put them on their shirts? We did. We got Liverpool to put them on for 1 week, which in itself, by the time you've laddered up all the coverage, it was over 1 billion eyeballs saw that. Could we create a lesson about the goals so that it goes to every school? So that became the world's largest, and that still goes on. And then over time, people like that feeling. Businesses particularly lent in and said, oh, what are these goals doing next? We can get behind these. These are something that we can plan over time. Businesses like to be able to plan and frameworks. And I honestly don't think the business community would have got involved with them to the extent they did if we hadn't really pushed them the way that we pushed them, positive, optimistic. We had famous people representing them at the UN. I remember David Beckham holding up a number and all sorts of tricks like that to get attention. And the world has unfortunately taken some turns, hasn't it? Which means that the goals haven't made as much progress as they could have done. But I think they were there as a North Star, and they still are there as a North Star that is generally accepted. And yeah, I hadn't thought about that as a proxy to what I'm doing now, but we put them into a certain culture. We forced them into the World Economic Forum at a time when the WEF wasn't particularly interested in having a new system. It had its own systems. So from the early days of doing really stupid stuff like building snowmen with 193 snowmen to represent each country with a scarf, the national scarf around their neck. And we got people like Chris Martin coming and taking his snowman selfie just to get them into culture. And then after a few years of that, I think the WEF just found us incredibly annoying and adopted them officially. Yeah. And things like partnering up with Freud's Communications, who we created the Goals House with them, which still goes on and is this incredibly powerful gathering spot just to talk about the goals. That's a sort of piece of real world culture that happens at COP and UNGA and Davos and the like. So yeah, I think it was the same principle, which is you have to communicate stuff in a way that people find interesting, enlivening, curious, rather than just shouting at them again that it's once and for all. You must solve this problem. And if you don't do this, you are doomed. That would never have come out of the goals campaign in our sort of tonality. Not to say that I don't think there's a place sometimes for that. Sometimes something happens that really demands urgent attention. And actually, the ecosystem of communications can take it all. I always used to think about Greta Thunberg in the early days. She's the epitome of furious shouting. But that was needed then because we were sort of burbling along a bit, thinking we had a bit more time than we did. But I think you can't only keep doing that. It's diminishing returns, being shouted at in the street again, like I was saying. People will then stop coming towards you and stop listening. And so you have to give them something that they are enjoying the process of being communicated and engaged with.
So then is awareness the main bottleneck in your view to outcomes?
I think that's a bit too generic to say that. If we're talking about nature finance, for example, I think awareness that the planet's not doing so well, that's, I think, accepted. I think what is not so known is awareness of the role that finance can play while still doing its core job of making returns for the investor, but it can also be done in such a way that will make returns for the planet. So one of our straplines at the NAT is nature returns, just to point out to people that it will return on investment actually better and for longer than a non-nature based investment over time, but also nature that can also come back. And I think that awareness is not there yet. So yeah, of course, if you're not aware of an issue and are not aware of what you can do about it, then you're not going to get involved to play those roles. But I think the general awareness that the planet's not doing well, I think that has been achieved. And again, the people who fought for years to make that known deserve credit for that. But I think tipping people into action to do something about it, particularly in the finance industry, requires a different form of communicating.
Okay, yeah. So, yeah, at what point does that transition change? Does the build-up of awareness then realize itself into capital movements?
I think at the point someone actually starts intentionally trying to do something about it, which is, we're not the only people doing it, but the reason we started now was the sense that it's coming. I work with a fantastic partner in the NAT called Jay Lipman, who founded a company called Ethic in New York, which is a big asset management company for largely family offices and a lot of next generational family offices. And he was seeing that these principles were certainly aligned in their values with the idea of using capital to also do good at scale. But they weren't being given the necessary opportunities or pathways to do. So it felt like that job of the awareness in general was being done enough to start moving, but no one was then taking that bull by the horns and pulling it forward to actual deployment of capital into nature positive investments. And so that's the work. I think we were about 12 months ago or 18 months ago, and we came up with a NAT. We were at that very point. And so that's why we did something as dramatic as we did with the NAT Gala, to really, you can imagine pushing someone over the top of a hill. They're nearly there. Go on, let's just push them over the top. So something like the Gala, like a huge cultural, bam, here's Billie Eilish, wham, let's tell Harrison Ford to talk about it. That really threw everything at it. and people enjoyed that. And now the work is to make sure that as they go down the other side of that mountain, they're meeting the actual projects that capital can be deployed into at scale with as much security that it will return as possible, right? There is, of course, like any new asset class, there's a degree of uncertainty and learning as you go. But in general, that landscape on the other side is still being built. I always think of big capital and small nature. Nature is, by definition, a series of millions of smaller hectares, smaller acres, and run by people like farmers and fishers. And they tend not to be in the World Economic Forum discussing with big family office how to take, or massive bank how to take hundreds of millions of dollars, because they can't. So there's a bridge that needs to be built there to get the investable projects in a shape that they can take the capital and the capital owners in a space that they feel good about deploying it. So I think that's the landscape now that needs to be and is being built to a degree, fanned by us and supported by the likes of the NAP, but really hundreds of organizations springing up who can connect those two sides together. Because what you don't want to do is walk someone up the mountain, get them all excited, push them over the top, and then have them have a sort of skiing accident on the way down, as it were. You want them to get down to that all the way, which is capital invested, returning, the project being supported for the long run, and therefore the positive flywheel continues.
Okay, yeah, so that's interesting. So it's not just a case of lighting fires and, and hoping it warms the right hearts. You want to see real outcomes. So in that sense, what does success or successes look like for you? Measurable.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I know what they are to see them, to say that we have caused them. I'm quite relaxed about. I think it's quite difficult in any sort of situation. And I get annoyed when I've seen people do it, saying that because we did this many billions of dollars happened. Did it though? Just because in any outcome, there's so many steps along the way, aren't there? So I'm not claiming credits. Oh, we could make this happen. But at the macro, what we want to happen is to close the nature finance gap. The nature finance gap is, last looked, $710 billion a year needs to be deployed into nature positive investments and businesses. That would be terrific if that got closed in 10 years. I don't know if that will happen, but if I could point to at the end of, 5 years of doing the NAT, $1 billion, $2 billion worth of investment, I could see where it started. And they perhaps came to a NAT or two. They were part of our roundtable series that we do all year round, being invested in a sizable project or some projects coming together to form the kind of scale that could take that kind of capital, then I'll be very happy indeed.
Yeah, I think you're being very modest. But I guess as by the same token, you've got to motivate your team and be motivating to the people you're talking to suggest that, well, we took this action and the consequences have been this. We've reduced the nature finance gap by X million or X billion.
Yeah, I'm going to not try and anonymize this action track that's going on at the moment. But for example, one of the action areas that's fallen out of the first year is the opportunity to invest differently in our food system. There's unquestionably, the food system that we have is not just terrifically unfair and unhealthy, but it's also crashing its own, but it's eating itself. The very sort of soil that is the baseline of all of the food that we grow is being denuded to such a point that it's going to stop returning on investment, right? It's going to simply stop growing. And then that's been catalyzed actually very recently by the war in the Middle East, because the fertilizer upon which that food system relies is not just stuck in the Middle East. Actually, the very infrastructure was destroyed right at the beginning of the conflict. So we now have an imperative to change the way we're farming, because if we don't do that, there will be no food for billions of acres. But we were working on it anyway, because it's such a great, scalable, it's a huge business, right? What do you call it? Your TAM. Your total addressable market, if you're investing in agriculture, is pretty big. So we have started working with a couple of players in that space who are underway. We've had some dinners, we've had some working roundtables, and now it looks like we've both got a solution. We've got a country that is coming in and buying that solution. And then we've got the opportunity come the General Assembly and Climate Week in New York to profile all of that in the hope that other countries will see it and other large investors will see that solution. And thus you've got a scaling solution in one of the world's biggest markets for positive nature investing. So that is underway. And it could be by the end of this year, there's some incredible results to show for that. And that will feel fantastic, because then you'll be able to see that you literally be able to quantify how much investment has been deployed into a particular solution that's going to regenerate this many acres of farmland, which could go on to feed this many millions of people. So yeah, I hope we'll end up with case studies like that, and we'll be happy to say we played a part in it because we were the ones that brought those people together at the various points. There were other people involved. There were other movements that got those people to do those things. But the fact that we had seen that happening over time will feel very satisfying.
Yeah, and that's phenomenally encouraging and some excellent potential outcomes. How do you deal, given your sort of brand and cultural background, how do you deal with the tidal backs and forths of cultural swings? The Nat Gala was terrifically successful last year. The Met Gala got a lot of negative kickback. Is the Nat Gala going to be a one-off for you, and then you bring in a new strategy, or are you expecting the tide just to go back again?
Yes, the Met Gala this year definitely had a messy year, didn't it? We are going to do the gala again. We're just with the Nat. So the idea, I'm a passionate convener and I'm a passionate believer in bringing people together. And I think when you bring people together and you lace it with culture, which is what the Nat Gala was, things happen, and kicked off the case study I just talked about there. So yeah, we'll do it again. The Met Gala's problems this year are well known. We know what happened there, and we're not in that. We don't have those problems. So I think what we're doing and why we're doing it won't attract the kind of backlash that happened at the Met this year. But look, the Met will be fine. It will bounce back. The amazing thing about culture, it's a bit like gardening. Things happen some years, they don't happen other years. Everyone forgets, it's fine. So I think you go into it knowing that. My problem is more, I always think about Richard Curtis talking about the difficult second album. We had such a great first album, as it were. The second one is going to be under pressure to be just as good. But good news, it is happening in September and it's shaping up to be really good. So I'm excited about it. Now, the third one, then you have to think, do you do something different? Do you change, if we're doing albums, do you change music genre? Do you add a new frontman? We'll have a think about it. But I'm pretty resilient. I think if you're creative, you tend to be quite, you're out there and experimental anyway. So I'm pretty comfy with things work out, they don't work out. Just try and do it again.
Okay. Yeah.
Everything is ultimately seasonal, especially in this kind of, as we were saying earlier, this ridiculous attention economy that comes through your phones. People move on. But I think what we did will endure. The principle of bringing people together, telling them a story in a way that is, we got fantastic, really fantastic feedback from the attendees of that gala about what a wonderful thing it was for a few hours to be held with such a brilliant, diverse group of investors, cultural leaders, practitioners, and to be connected around this topic of we are nature. So this year, actually, we're all about water. So this year, the theme is that water is life. And we'll be talking about all the water from ice to rivers to lakes to the ocean, and looking again at where are the sort of pressure points, where is it that capital could unlock those pressure points, and then what could we achieve in terms of solutions and impact, done with culture and creativity and joy. So I'm pretty confident we'll pull it off again this year, and then we'll assess that and see what we do next.
What's the strongest criticism of your strategy that you feel that you have to take seriously?
That's interesting. I don't know if it's a criticism. Definitely the question of how do you know if it's worked? And I'm, as you spotted, I don't think it's modesty. I'm just really comfortable with going, well, you don't, but I love doing it. And people seem to love doing it and things are happening. So I'm quite loose on the hard outcome metrics, which is me very much at odds, therefore, they're more for a sort of financial oriented system. But I am comfortable about it. So I don't really feel I have to address that. I think I just want to make sure that we make the most of the potential. So if there was criticism that, what we don't need is more rich people drinking champagne and saving the world, I get that. And I want to make sure that if you are to do that, because we need to take that into different chunks, rich people, well, we need them because they're the ones who are deploying the capital, and we need that to be deployed differently. So I make no apology for bringing them together, but I'm going to put them with nature people and cultural people to help them do the right thing with that capital. And I therefore want that to really count. So I don't think it's so much criticism as I really feel that as a responsibility I have. If you've managed to build this network and this room of people, the responsibility to make it count is something I carry very heavily. I'm not from that. I'm from Newcastle. I'm a Geordie who came from a very regular background. So this is not my world, but somehow I've ended up being able to curate it with the help of an incredible set of partners. So I really feel the responsibility to do something good with it. And therefore, if someone says, "Oh, that's not what we need, bunch of rich people getting together," I'm like, well, I know what that looks like. And because believe me, I'm not one of them. But I feel like who else is going to move their capital? They want to do the right thing. So let's make it count. But yeah, I think there's no harsher critic than myself. And I think that's how I deal with criticism.
So is that the biggest misconception people have about celebrity endorsement or super rich endorsement? That it's just so much hot air? Or where must the focus be? Outcomes, I suppose.
Well, I think the biggest misconception is that people see people either because they have got a name or like a figure after the name, and they assume therefore that they must be acting in some way falsely, or someone's paid them to do it, or they're not in it for the right reasons. And I just don't think that's true. I think it's really hard once you've got profile, especially if you're famous. And I think it's really hard once you've got wealth, because the world does probably begin to en masse look at you a bit differently. And therefore probably it gets harder to do the right thing, to know what the right thing is, to feel that you are acting on the best information and having the most impact with your wealth or fame. So I'm on their side in that sense. Obviously, there's bad actors everywhere. So there's people who do things because they're paid and they're disingenuous, or they have a platform and they use it to ends that maybe aren't helpful. But on balance, I'm an optimist, and I genuinely believe that the people we work with and attract to the gala are there because they want to make something really good happen because of either who they are, what they've done, what they're known for, and therefore I want to help them do that. And you can think badly of things, you can be cynical. I think my biggest bugbear in life is cynicism. I think it's fine to be skeptical, it's fine to ask questions, and it's fine to be rigorous to make sure that you've done your homework and your due diligence. But I can't stand cynics who just exist to say, "Oh, well, that's not going to happen," or "They must be this or that." Because what's the point of that? That literally gets you nowhere.
Yeah.
So I think I approach everything with a degree of sunny optimism, underpinned by a degree of skepticism, just to check. But on balance, I hope for the best.
Yeah, there's plenty of people in life that are just hardwired to ask the difficult questions, but not so good about giving the hard answers.
But I don't mind asking the difficult questions. It's like what I can't bear is people who pride themselves on asking the hard questions but won't listen to the answer if it's not the one they wanted. So, I remember being trained. I used to work for the BBC, and you got a load of, it was back in the day, W1A era for sure. You got a load of fantastic training courses, but one of them was the power of, the difference between cynicism and skepticism, and how useful to have a skeptical line of questioning is a very good thing to have, and a good muscle to work if you're not that way inclined. But cynicism is the death of creativity and the death of progress, because cynicism doesn't listen to the answer and therefore act accordingly. Cynicism is just waiting to be reconfirmed that you were right all along, and that's not helpful.
Totally agree. But the Nat is hugely successful. What changes in the real world?
I think at a macro level, there has been a shift of consciousness and awareness that we are nature. We started with that phrase. I think we've become, as a species, extremely separated in our minds, that we're human beings and then nature's over there. And I think technology exacerbates it, because we increasingly exist on screens and in boxes and feel like we're masters of the universe because we can do these incredible things. But we're still made of atoms. I was having this wild conversation with my very clever son last night. He was doing his A-levels, and he was telling me about something about quantum behavior of atoms, which is they behave differently when they're being. Do you know what I mean? And I was examining him, helping him revise for his geography A-level, and he was talking about the carbon cycle and about how we are all just made. We are very carbon. We're all carbon sinks, just like whales, just like trees, because our very cells, everything starts with the C that we're made of. And I think if we can get people understanding that we are nature, I think if we can have a quantum shift in our perception of that we are part of this natural system, then I will feel really happy. I really fear that we are increasing our own sense of separateness from nature. But as soon as the water runs out, as soon as there isn't any food, we'll be hurtled into that realization that we were part of it all along. So I think at a macro level, that kind of consciousness shift and that getting comfy with the idea that we're part of nature would be a great success for me. And then, as we were touching on earlier, in a kind of tangible way, I think if we're seeing a vibe shift in nature becoming an asset class, the way that 20 years ago, infrastructure wasn't an asset class. You couldn't just invest in bridges, invest in roads. And now it's $1 trillion asset class. I feel like if there's a natural allocation in any portfolio, that what's the nature bit, and that's growing, that will feel successful. And then very concretely, like I say, if there's a couple of deals or funds that we can look at and say, wow, we saw that birth, as it were, through the NAP cycle in 2027, that would feel good as well. But really, this concept of we are nature, I think we're so far from it. We are in the West. I think it's the kind of thing that indigenous cultures and certain countries even, I think, are closer to it. But the sort of Northern Hemisphere tech obsessed West, I think we're quite a long way from that. And yet, you look at, I live in the UK, passionate river swimmer. You look at the consciousness rate shift that's happened in this country over the last few years about rivers, about our rivers. During COVID, everyone really realized how much we needed them, swam in them, got in them, they're an escape. And then the whole messaging about, oh no, they've been messed up by the water system and the farming system. And you've had this real growing of consciousness about our connectivity to water, which is, I think, if that could happen at the macro and people could realize that there is just one Earth system and we're part of it, we'd stop treating it so badly.
Yeah. What gives you hope right now, and what still really concerns you?
I'll start with the concern. The concern is the fact that the world seems to be increasingly run by about 5 men, none of whom seem to care much about anybody else, the natural system, human beings, whether it's conflict, whether it's crazy intensification of inequality. Sometimes you feel like you're really pushing against the tide, right? You just think one thing's getting better and then that breaks out. So that I get really worried about. But it is outweighed by my levels of hope when you look at the amount of restoration that is going on, changes in behaviors, practices, awareness, that is going on. I talked earlier about my friend Tom Crowther and the positive feedback loops. He has a platform called Restore, which maps every corner of the earth in terms of where is regenerative and restorative action happening from a landscape perspective, from an ecology perspective. And it's beautiful. And you just have to look at that and realize the pace of change and the rate of change. Christiana Figueres, who's always an inspiration to me, the lady who led the UNFCCC during the Paris era, now runs a thing called Global Optimism, brilliant title. She always points out the progress in things like renewables and the pace of change there. That change is happening. And I think we need to get that story out more, because that gives me hope. And I think when you point out to anyone those trajectories, restorative practices going on, new discoveries happen all the time that show us how we can get from A, bad place, to B, great place. It's all happening, but those stories don't get out. And the daily news cycle, the hourly news cycle, is dominated by the wrong ones at the top, those wrong 5 blokes at the top who are blowing it all up. So I think we need to just keep going with the good stories, because they're there and they'll engender more progress and more positive outcomes.
Yeah. Looking back overall, do you then think awareness was the main bottleneck always? Or have you come to believe that the harder challenge is converting awareness into action?
I think action's the harder challenge. Yeah. I think that's why I switched out of the SDG kind of Project Everyone era, which was still going on because the goals will go till 2030, and the organization that we started is still very much promoting those. And that's an awareness machine at its heart, because it was born to create awareness for a brand new thing. But I think the action piece is the harder piece. Awareness is almost easy at the moment. If you throw enough at it, you'll get traction and people can be aware of it. But for how long? And you have to keep someone's attention for quite a long time, and then get it much deeper ingrained into them before they take an action. So I think the harder challenge is action. And something like investing, I've been amazed by how long it takes to really get the thing over the actually in signed, and at any point it can just evaporate. And so I think that's where I'm in the chain that goes awareness to completion. I'm trying to anchor my activities in our organization's power to just keeping that, holding that. I hate that thing, feet to the fire, because it sounds really unpleasant, but just to keep that action thread going until it's done. That's where I want to be for the next decade, is just making sure that it doesn't bleed out. Again, horrible analogy, but we've all been in amazing meetings. I've been in so many kind of wonderful sessions of varying sizes where you feel the change happening. Someone will start, it will build, the collaboration is going, there's energy, but you know that people are going to go home from that dinner or forum or conference and they're going to get busy again and they're going to get distracted and it's not going to happen. And so I think, how can we keep that action, almost protect it so that no one leaves until it's done? That's what I'm obsessed with.
Excellent. And what's the next big milestone for you and for the NAT?
Well, there's a huge one, a huge kind of activation week coming up in 2 weeks, in London Climate Action Week, where we're doing roundtables on agriculture, on fashion, on the big dinner for the ocean. So that's just busy, but there we're launching the gala for this year. So that the next peak will be in September at Climate Week in New York, where, as I said earlier, that's going to all be about water. And then next year, we've got a few different projects bubbling, getting more into content, getting more into films, supporting films one about the ocean, one about the watershed, and thinking about what we do with the gala in year 3. There's a sort of really immediate London peak of the year for this year, New York in September, all about water, and then year 3, third album.
Well, that's been amazing, Gail. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
That was Gail Gallie. And as I reflected on this conversation, 2 thoughts stayed with me. The first is that we spend a great deal of time talking about what we're trying to avoid. Climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, resource scarcity. Those risks are real and they matter. But perhaps we spend far less time talking about what we're actually trying to create. What does a thriving future look like? Is it a world powered by abundant clean energy? Cities designed around people rather than congestion? AI technology helping us use resources more intelligently, restore ecosystems, eliminate waste and improve human well-being? A world with less disease, less hunger and greater opportunity while preserving the richness and diversity of the natural world on which we all depend. Whether or not that vision is fully achievable, it is surely a future worth striving for. The second thought is that one theme has emerged repeatedly across this podcast series: the extraordinary range of solutions that sustainable finance can help bring to life. We've explored green buildings and greener cities, geothermal and solar power, nature restoration, new technologies and innovative business models tackling some of society's biggest challenges. Again and again, we've seen that capital has the power not only to avoid harm, but to build something better. Which brings me back to Gail's central point. Perhaps lasting change is driven not only by fear of what happens if we fail, but by belief in what becomes possible if we succeed. Fear can capture attention, but vision creates momentum. And if we build a compelling, positive picture of the future we want to create, perhaps that vision can become one of the most powerful forces for change of all. Thanks for listening to Green Money Matters.
If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe to Green Money Matters on your favorite podcast platform and never miss an opportunity to grow your wealth sustainably. Together, let's make money matter for the planet. Stay tuned for our next exciting episode, where we'll explore groundbreaking investment opportunities and unveil the secrets of successful sustainable investors. Until then, remember, green money matters. Because investing in our planet's future is the smartest choice you can make. Thanks for joining us.